Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Abomination of Desolation in Daniel chapters 10 and 11. Daniel 10:1 starts off in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, we've looked in earlier treatments of Daniel, the book of Daniel. Cyrus had actually been reigning for a longer period, but this seems to be, I think, that this is beginning the point in the third year after Cyrus had now taken over Babylon. And that had happened in the year 539 BC. Prior to that, you'd had Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar sort of joint ruling. And then Babylon fell in November of, it was around October, November, I forget exactly which, of November 539. And you also have somebody named Darius the Mede. That might have been either another name for Cyrus, but I suspect it might have been Gobrias, who was a governor under Cyrus, just a governor of Babylon. After all, Cyrus is going to be king or emperor of the entire Persian army, and he'll last until 530, after which he'll die, and he'll be succeeded by his son Cambyses. Notice this is the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. A message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, and the message was true and one of great conflict, but he understood the message and had an understanding of the vision. So you're about to see, first you're going to see how he gets it, and then you're going to see the vision itself and its explanation. Verse 2, in those days, I, Daniel, notice verse 1 actually talked about Daniel in the third person, which Daniel chapters 1 through 7 had done. But now it's I, Daniel, had been mourning for these for 3 entire weeks. I did not eat any tasty food, nor did meat or wine enter my mouth as he's fasting. Notice it's not necessarily a total fast, but he's fasting from certain tasty food, from meat or wine. Maybe he's on bread and water. I don't know what he is eating. Notice, nor did I use any ointment at all until the entire 3 weeks were completed. We would say I did without a shower or deodorant. I was sort of going it rough because and this was part of his commitment to fast before the Lord. He's seeking a word from the Lord. And notice this takes place for an entire 3 weeks. Now, that 3 week period is going to come up in our story in just a few minutes. On the 24th day of the first month, and I'm assuming, I could be wrong, but I'm assuming the first month is the month of Nisan, that is the first month of the Jewish New Year, which means by the 24th month, Passover is now past him. And you say, well, didn't he celebrate Passover? Wouldn't they eat and drink certain things? But remember, Passover was a celebration of their freedom, and they were not free. Well, perhaps some of them were. After all, Cyrus had told the Jewish people if they wished to, they could go back to the land. But here's Daniel. He's not back in the land. He's still in Mesopotamia. He's by the Tigris River. In fact, we're going to see that here on the 24th day of the first month, while I was by the bank of the great river that is the Tigris. The Tigris is one of the two rivers, along with the Euphrates, that makes up the land of Mesopotamia. The word Mesopotamia just means land between the rivers. It's the land where Babylon was located, but it's also the land that had now been taken over by the Persians. I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen. Now, this man is going to be described in such a way that makes me wonder, is he really a man? But I'm just going to go by what the passage says, and I'm going to treat it as if that's the case. But I'm also going to have a question mark in the back of my mind. A certain man dressed in linen, whose waist was girded with a belt of pure gold of Uphaz. Verse 6, his body also was like beryl, his face had the appearance of lightning, his eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a tumult. This man, to my vision, looks both very unusual and yet strangely familiar. And I say strangely familiar because I see somebody looking very much like this in Revelation chapter 1. And when I read the context of Revelation chapter 1, it's the glorified Jesus. So what's going on here? And my answer again is, I don't know. But this is a messenger from God, and yet maybe more than just a messenger from God. Verse 7, now I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, while the men who were with me did not see the vision. So he's not by himself, but he's the only one who sees. Again, this reminds me of something I read later on in the Bible. When I get to the book of Acts, you have the Apostle Paul, who has an encounter of all people with Jesus. And yet there were others that were with him that they saw something was going on, but they didn't see Jesus. And that's what happens here. Nevertheless, a great dread fell on them, and they ran away to hide themselves. They realize something had shown up. They don't know what it is. They don't see what Daniel sees, but they experience just a taste of the presence of whoever has come. Verse 8, so I was left alone and saw this great vision, yet no strength was left in me, for my natural color turned to a deathly pallor, and I retained no strength. This just takes all the energy out of him. Verse 9, but I heard the voice of his words, and as soon as I heard the sound of his words, I fell into a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. So not only was there a vision, but now it's a vision that is turned into a sleeping vision/dream. Verse 10, then behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. Notice the hand. The hand is raising him up. We've seen a hand earlier in the book of Daniel. There was a hand that came and wrote on the wall. Is this the same hand? I don't want to say that it is. I don't know. But there, throughout this narrative, there are touches of familiarity. Verse 11, he said to me, O Daniel, man of high esteem. I think that's just a wonderful thing to hear. Wouldn't it be great to hear from the Lord that you are one of high esteem? Well, you've heard that because the Lord speaks about how he loves, how he esteems his people, those who have believed in him. O Daniel, man of high esteem, understand the words that I'm about to tell you, and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up. So he went from being knocked down, unconscious, asleep, to raised up, to now standing, and yet there's a trembling. I've often said it before that if you come into the presence of God and you don't have just a little bit of fear and trembling, then I suggest you haven't come into the presence of God. And Daniel is in the presence. Verse 12, then he said to me, do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words. That was 21 days ago, 3 weeks earlier. Verse 13, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. He was sent immediately. And meanwhile, Daniel is praying and fasting and praying and fasting and praying and fasting. And all this time, there has been a hindrance from the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Who is the prince of the kingdom of Persia? We're not told, but there seems to be behind the scenes in Persia, you have a king, an emperor, but you seem to have behind the scenes a spiritual battle unseen by human eyes that has been taking place. Notice he was withstanding me for 21 days, and then behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, this is on God's side, came to help me, for I had been left there with the kings of Persia. And so there's this unseen battle, and we're not told the details. We're not told how it worked out. It reminds me of the book of Job, where we have the presence of God, and Satan shows up, and there's the sons of God, and what's that all about? And then we are allowed to peek just a little bit behind the scenes and see that there's this encounter where Satan is given permission to tempt Job on 2 different occasions and in 2 different manners. And here again, we're allowed to peek just for a a brief glimpse behind the curtain to see that there's something more taking place in our history than we have ever realized. And verse 14, now I have come to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision pertains to the days yet future. Verse 20, then he said, and he begins to lay this out. I'm skipping forward a few verses. Then he said to me, do you understand why I came to you? But I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. Notice the battle may have been paused so that he could come to Daniel, but the war continues. The conflict, those things going on behind the scenes aren't finished yet. And so he says, so I am going forth, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. However, I will tell you what is inscribed in the writing of truth. Yet there is no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael, your prince. Sounds like there's a labor shortage going on. And so you have this prince of Persia, and you have the prince of Greece, and you have Michael. And in what place do they play? How are these things working behind the scenes to bring about that thing that we call human history? And I teach classes in history and civilization and church history. But as I teach those classes, I'm only teaching what's out in front, not the behind the scenes, because frankly, I don't know all that's going on behind the scenes, and neither do you. But it helps to know that there's more than meets the eye. And when we see nations rise and nations fall, and elections come and elections go, and we wonder, what on earth is going on? There's things of which God is aware that you and I are not. And it is in his hands, and we can trust in him. Well, we come now to chapter 11, verse 1. That was all introductory. Now we begin to see the vision itself. And remember, but notice, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement to him and a protection for him. Now, this isn't Daniel speaking. This seems to be the angel, the person, whoever it is, that's speaking to Daniel. And again, that Darius the Mede, we asked, was that a question? Was that another name for Cyrus? Was that this person we know in history as Gobrias? Maybe somebody else entirely. But some things have been going on before Daniel started to pray. And verse 2, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. You see, you had Cyrus. He was the one who had brought Persia to dominance, had conquered Babylon. And then after him, notice you're going to have Cambyses. That will be the son of Cyrus. After Cambyses dies, I want to wedge in a name. I'm not sure if he's significant here. There's somebody pretending to be a different son of Cyrus. His name is Smerdis, but we're led to believe that he had actually been killed before actually becoming king. And yet somebody claiming to be him rises up. I'm not sure if he plays a part. And so Darius is not a son of Cambyses. He's a different cousin. It actually goes to, there's no immediate heir, so it goes to someone else that's sort of extended family. And then Darius, there'll be a 4th king, and that is the son of Darius. That will be Xerxes. And notice a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. And if you know anything about Xerxes, Darius had a small invasion, like an expedition against Greece, but it's Xerxes who came with an army of 500,000 men and invaded Greece and fought some epic battles all the way down throughout the Greek peninsula, all the way to the naval battle of Salamis, where his forces were defeated, and the following year, the rest of the Persian forces were defeated. And after that, they departed from Greece, never to return. Verse 3, and a mighty king will arise. Now, I think what we have is perhaps a number of years, roughly 200 years, if we're talking about Xerxes, because this mighty king now is going to be none other than Alexander the Great. and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. And it doesn't surprise us to see these things because Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7 and chapter 8 have already given us details regarding these kings and their kingdoms. And so this mighty king arises. Verse 4, but as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass. And as Alexander the Great died, he did not leave a successful heir behind him. It was after his death that a son was born to him, but that son did not even make it out of childhood. And instead, his generals each grabbed pieces of the kingdom, and it was parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his descendants. Like I said, he did not leave any heirs, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. And so, as Alexander lay on his deathbed, his generals gathered around and said, to whom do you give your kingdom? And he whispered, to the strongest. And as a result, each of the generals said, well, I'm strongest. No, I am. No, I am. And the kingdom was ripped apart into many little pieces, each of the generals fighting over their little section. When the dust finally settled, there were 4 big winners. One of those was this king to the south, verse 5. Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion, this other prince, his dominion will be a great dominion indeed. And what happens, you have, of course, just to get our bearings, you notice the little kingdom of Judah. Some of the Jews had returned from the land. The king to the south of Judah, notice not directly south, but that's going to be Ptolemy. He's one of the generals of Alexander, and he's going to grab Egypt, and he will rule Egypt, and his descendants will rule Egypt for the next 200 years. His descendants, and it becomes very easy to remember their names because they're all named Ptolemy. He's Ptolemy the first, and then there's going to be Ptolemy the second, third, fourth, fifth, all the way down to Ptolemy the 13th. And almost all of them are father to son. Ptolemy the sixth and seventh are actually brothers, but the rest of them are going to go father to son, all the way until we get to Ptolemy the 13th, who will have a big sister that's going to play a bigger part. Her name's going to be Cleopatra, but that's a different story. But notice there's also a different king, we said. I said 4 big winners. We're only going to look at 2 of them. The other big winner is a general by the name of Seleucus. And Seleucus grabs for himself Anatolia, that area to the north with the Halys River, but also to the east and far off on a map to the east, eventually all the way almost to India. But notice the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy. And so one of his princes is Seleucus. Seleucus actually came and worked for Ptolemy at first, but then was sent by Ptolemy to engage one of those other generals. And when the dust settled, he had grabbed this territory for himself. And his dominion will be a great dominion indeed, like I said, stretching all the way to India. And so Ptolemy the first, he takes Egypt. Seleucus started off as a general under him, but then after some years, they will form an alliance. You see, at first, wait a minute, I sent you off to work for me. Well, I don't want to work for you anymore. But after some years, they'll form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. And so you had the daughter of Ptolemy. Her name was, now I know in English we think we ought to pronounce that Bernice, but there is no C in the Greek language, so I've just written it that way for our consideration. The way they would pronounce that would be Berniki. And I won't always give good pronunciations, but I can't resist in this case. So Berniki, notice she's going to be given to the king of the north, and by this time Seleucus has a son by the name of Antiochus II. You say, well, what happened to Antiochus I? That had been his father. In fact, that word Antiochus is going to give rise to a number of cities named Antioch. When we get to the New Testament, we'll see two different cities named Antioch, and they're all named after the father of Seleucus. So we have Antiochus II, and Bernice is going to be married to him, but the problem is he's already got a wife, and not only a wife, but they have a child. They have Seleucus II. But in the interests of forming this union and this alliance, Laodike is going to be divorced. Now she's still alive somewhere, and she didn't want to be divorced, but she is. And now Bernice is going to marry Antiochus II. The rest of verse 6, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her as well as he who supported her in those times. Well, what takes place is Antiochus dies. You say, well, how did he die? And we're not entirely sure. Maybe he had a little bit of help. Now, Bernice wouldn't have been helping, but there was somebody else. Laodike was still around, and I don't know if she was the one who offed her husband or former husband, divorced husband, but she does make sure that Bernice has an accident and is put away, not just put away, not just, but is actually killed. Um, and Ptolemy, well, that by this time we're down to Ptolemy the third. You've had Ptolemy the first, second, third, and he doesn't like the fact that his sister was killed, so he organizes an expedition to take vengeance. And so, he's going to notice, but one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. He's actually going to capture Antioch, the capital, and he'll deal with them and display great strength. And by the way, he's going to make sure that Bernice meets her end, and she does. Now, her son is still alive, but notice we've gone to from not very nice to alliance to warfare. Verse 8, also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt. He's going to bring some plunder back to Egypt, and he, on his part, will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. So even though there had been some family issues, Seleucus II is allowed to continue as king. Ptolemy III goes back home to Egypt, and for a time, the dust settles, and for a time, there's at least a cessation of hostilities, if not outright peace. Verse 9, then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south. Notice it's going to go now the other way, with Seleucus coming now against Ptolemy, but that's not going to go so well. His sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. And so Seleucus is going to meet his end, and instead now we will see Antiochus III, it's his younger brother, and he's known in history not just as Antiochus III, but sometimes as Antiochus the Great, because he's going to accomplish quite a number of things. He's going to come against Ptolemy. Now, this isn't going to start off so good. The king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. So, king of the north are the Seleucids, in this case, Antiochus III. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hands of the former. So we have Antiochus III coming down against Ptolemy at this epic battle of Raphia in 217 BC, just to give you a sort of a date when these things are taking place. And Antiochus III suffers a great defeat. You say, well, how can you call him Antiochus the Great? Well, he's going to rebound from that. Verse 12, when the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. And so you have the battle. See, verse 13, for the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former. And after an interval of some years, he's going to have to regroup a bit. He will press on with a great army and much equipment. And so they come down, they clash again, this time a bit further north, at the Battle of Banias. This is a place at the upper reaches of the Jordan River. If you've ever been to what later on would be called Caesarea Philippi, that's the same location. It's as far north as you can be and still be in old Israel. And so 200 BC, they fight this battle, and this time it's very different. This time, this time, Antiochus wins against the general of Ptolemy. Ptolemy himself is not there. It's one of his generals that loses the battle. And that means that Judah will now come under the influence and under the control of the Seleucids. He fights the battle. There is at this time a pro-Seleucid party in Jerusalem. It had been put down by the Ptolemies. After all, they don't want anybody to be pro-Seleucid. But the Egyptian general, after this battle, he retreats to Sidon. Sidon is a Phoenician city right on the coast. Notice verse 14, now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Notice that seems to be a reference to this pro-Seleucid party. And then verse 15, the king of the north will come, cast a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. And so you have the fall of Sidon, takes place a couple years later, where the general of Ptolemy has retreated. Like I said, Ptolemy V is back in Egypt. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. And so Antiochus has come down, has captured Judah. Verse 17, he will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. You know, say, what's that referring to? Well, what happens is Antiochus, now that he's won Judah, he's won what he considers to be sort of the buffer state, he enters into an alliance with Ptolemy V. And he's able to win this alliance and have, he can set the truce on his terms. His daughter Cleopatra, that's how we're going to get the name Cleopatra. Now, by the time we get to the Cleopatra with which you're familiar, she'll be Cleopatra the Seventh. I'm not sure what number this one has, but this daughter, Cleopatra, will be given to Ptolemy as a wife with the idea that, she can sort of help be my secret agent behind the scenes. But instead, she turns out to be very loyal to her new husband. And instead of being an undercover agent against Egypt, she's going to be pro-Egypt, and she's actually going to give her new husband all sorts of military information to help overcome dear old dad if they go back to war again. Verse 18, and then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many. But a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. Now, what happens is next Antiochus, he's settled things with Ptolemy, even though that took place with his daughter. And now he turns his attention to the west, and he invades Greece. Even though Rome had given him a warning, Rome said, don't come this way. We're handling Greece. And yet he sees himself eventually going into conflict with Rome. He invades Greece against the advice, actually the demands of Rome, and he's defeated by the Roman forces, two different battles, one at Thermopylae, a famous name for when the Persians had invaded and fought the Greeks there, and also at the city of Magnesia. So two different battles. Um, Antiochus is defeated and is forced to retreat. And as a result of his peace now that he goes into with Rome, he has to send hostages to Rome, including one of his sons, his younger son, is actually sent as a hostage to Rome. Now, when I say hostage to Rome, that doesn't mean he's in prison or in chains. It's sort of like when Daniel was taken to Babylon. Daniel, he ate at the king's table and was supposed to eat the king's food. Daniel had kosher issues with that, but that's another story. Likewise, the son of Antiochus the third is going to go to Rome, but he's going to have it, good. He'll do his college degree there. He'll have a college roommate, and things will work out for him quite well. Verse 19, so, back to Antiochus, he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more. He's going to come to an end. You see, the Romans had followed Antiochus into Anatolia, and as a result, he was forced not just to give over the hostages, but also to raise money to pay off Rome. And to raise the money, he started going into different temples, not only here on our map, but to the east in Persia. And he was killed while plundering a Persian temple. They didn't like the fact that he was taking money out of the offering plate. Uh, and the mob set upon him, and he was killed as a result. Now, I said he had a son in Rome. He also had a son that was back here at the capital. In his place, and here's the two sons, the oldest was Seleucus IV. The younger one, the one in Rome, was Antiochus IV. Well, notice then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, according to Jewish writings. This one actually sets himself against the Jewish people, but he doesn't last very long. And the Jews looked at that and said, oh, look, God took care of this one who was sort of against us. So notice, yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. So somehow he dies. And meanwhile, Antiochus IV, and I'm not sure of the time frame here, but Seleucus IV had become king. He tries to plunder the Jewish temple and dies as a result, not at the hand of the Jews, at somebody else's hands, but he is assassinated. He comes to a bitter end. In his place, a despicable person will arise, and what happens is Antiochus IV escapes from Rome. But the time frame, we're not exactly sure what happened where. You see, Antiochus IV had everything to gain from his older brother dying. But his older brother had left a son, so Antiochus IV, he escapes from Rome. He comes back and he says, "Oh, I'm going to just be regent for my nephew, the son of Seleucus IV, until he's old enough, and then he'll be the next king. He's the rightful king. I'm just going to be the nice old uncle who helps out." But it won't be long until that nephew comes to an untimely end as well. And the suspicion is that Antiochus IV maybe had arranged the death of both his older brother as well as his nephew. Notice he's called here in Daniel 11:21, and this is all prophecy. In his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. He wasn't supposed to be king, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue, sort of underhanded. And by all accounts, that seems to have taken place on the part of Antiochus IV. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the Prince of the Covenant. Now, the Prince of the Covenant sounds something like it has something to do with the Jews, the people of Judah. Well, sure enough, the high priest um, uh, Onias had taken an anti-Hellenistic position. Now, Hellenistic is just another word for Greek. And you will remember that both the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and the people in Greece, obviously, they are all Hellenists. That is to say, they are all Greek culture and their Greek ancestry, and they all speak Greek. And Onias, the high priest, had said, there's just too much Greek influence coming on, and we're not rebelling, but let's put a halt to all of these Greek practices, eating Greek um, non-kosher food, and going to worship in Greek temples, and all the things that the Greeks do. Going into the gymnasiums, that was a very Greek thing, and going to Greek plays and Greek theaters. Let's not do any of that because we're starting to forget God and we don't want to forget the Lord. So the high priest takes a very anti-Hellenistic position and meets with an untimely end. There's a pattern here of people that don't really like Antiochus IV having accidents. Verse 23, after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception. He will go up and gain power with a small force of people. And Jason, the brother of Onias, offers a bribe to Antiochus IV in order to get the high priesthood. He said, look, we've got a big treasury in the temple. If you make me high priest, I'll make sure that some of those temple funds make their way into your private hands. The only problem is that there's another bidder for that position, an evil person by the name, this is a Jewish person by the name of Menelaus. You say, why is he evil? He's not a priest. He's not even from the descendants of either Aaron or a Levite. He's from a different tribe altogether, from the house of Tobias. And he puts in his bid. He offers more money. And so Jason is outbid. And Antiochus IV doesn't really care. He's just going to give it to whoever gives him promises him the most money. And so in verse 24, in a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest part of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. And what he would do, Antiochus IV would take his armies and march, again, off our map, way off our map, all the way to India, before returning to the Middle East with great riches and also with a secret weapon, war elephants. And he's going to come back to the Middle East, ready now to try to make himself, you see, remember his father has been called Antiochus the Great. He wants to be Antiochus the Greater. No, he's not going to be content to that. He's going to give himself a much more exalted title. Verse 25, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. It's time to go back to Egypt. With a large army, so the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. And so there's an invasion of Egypt, 170 BC, and the Egyptians, even though they have a large, extremely large, mighty army, the Egyptians are routed. Memphis, that's where modern-day Cairo is, Memphis is captured. Verse 26, those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. The queen mother dies, and now two court officials convince young Ptolemy the sixth to flee Egypt. Look, you're going to be captured and killed, and you don't want that to happen. And so his brother Ptolemy the seventh now becomes pharaoh. Verse 27, as for both kings, and you've got the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. I said the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, but now I've got two Ptolemies. I've got Ptolemy the sixth, and I've got Ptolemy the seventh. And there's a good bit of court intrigue going on, and now Ptolemy the sixth is put back in power but now he's going to be under Antiochus IV. And so all the wheelings and dealings and, oh yeah, there's a Ptolemy on the throne, but he's doing what I tell him to do because he's a puppet of my making. Verse 28, then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. Notice on his way back, each time he comes down to Egypt, on his way back, he's passing through Judah. And this time he just doesn't, just pass through, but he's made these arrangements as to who is going to be the high priest and who's going to collect the money from the temple offerings and strip the money out of the temple treasury to pay for all of these military endeavors. Verse 21, verse 29, at the appointed time he'll return and come into the south. He's going to come back. But this last time it will not turn out to be the way it did before. And so Ptolemy, notice Ptolemy the sixth, and then Ptolemy the seventh, instead of being at odds with each other, which had worked in the favor of Antiochus IV, now they put aside their differences. One story has it that their sister sort of works out. She is the arbitrator, and they get together. Okay, we'll forget about Antiochus. We're just going to rule Egypt by ourselves. And so now Antiochus IV, he had put things into place the way he wanted to. That's been disturbed, and now he invades Egypt. Well, taking Egypt the last time was no problem. Taking Egypt this time is no problem. Both pharaohs find themselves trapped in Alexandria. That's the capital city during this time of the Ptolemies. It's right on the coast. But now we have entry of a new player. Well, it's not a total new player. We've talked about it before, and that is Rome. For ships of Kittim, and whenever you see that word Kittim, that's just code word for Rome. For ships of Kittim will come against him. Now, it's not an entire giant navy. It's not a big Roman expedition. What happens instead, there's a delegation led by Gaius Popilius Laenus. And Popilius, if we believe some of the other writings and stories that we're told, Popilius had been remember how I said when Antiochus IV had been in Rome, he'd been in college and had a roommate. Well, Popilius, according to one story, had been his roommate. So they actually knew each other. They had been college friends. And this delegation is led by, let's read the prophecy first. Ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore, he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action so he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. You say, what's that all about? Well, this delegation comes and the city gates of Alexandria, as he's about to capture the city and do away with both of these Ptolemies, out comes his friend Popilius. Oh, my good friend, I'm so glad to see you. And instead of greeting him, Popilius hands him a message from the Senate at Rome and reads it to him and says, the Senate has given you an order. Go home, leave Egypt, because Egypt has now come under the protection, sort of the protection, of Rome. Now, that doesn't mean Rome's ruling Egypt yet. That's going to happen later. But he's given this ultimatum, and Antiochus says, well, I'll think about it. And Popilius says, you can think about it all you want. He takes a stick and draws a circle on the sound around Antiochus and says, you can think about it all you want, but you must give me your answer before you step out of that circle. And so Antiochus says, okay, I guess I'm going home. And he packs up his army and he leaves. Now, you know how these days you have all sorts of urban legends, and sometimes you have what we call fake news. Well, fake news makes it back to Jerusalem that he has died. And he hasn't, but that's the news that makes it back to Jerusalem, and the Jews start celebrating this one who pillaged the temple, who took all of our gold and things, who put his own person as high priest, Menelaus. We don't like Menelaus. They actually kill Menelaus. They have a party, and they're celebrating. And Antiochus returns now to Jerusalem, and he looks at what's going on, and he is enraged. And he imposes the following regulations. He says, your problem is this religion that you have. Well, we're going to do away with that. From now on, Jews are not allowed to assemble for prayer. Observance of the Sabbath is forbidden. Possession of the scriptures is illegal. Circumcision is illegal. Any woman, any mother found with a circumcised baby, the baby is killed, is tied around her neck, and then she herself is put to death. The dietary laws are illegal. pagan sacrifices are mandated, and this begins to take place all throughout this tiny kingdom of Judah. Verse 31, and forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, that is the temple, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. The phrase, the abomination of desolation, yes, we're going to read about it later in the New Testament, but when you read about it in the New Testament, you're supposed to say, I remember that, Daniel prophesied that, and if you knew anything about Jewish history, you would have known that it was something that was brought about by Antiochus IV. Verse 32, by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. We're told that there are actually some among the Jews who said, yeah, okay, we'll go along with this new religion. After all, you're where the power is, and we want to get in. There are going to be those that are persuaded to abandon God and turn toward this paganism. First Maccabees tells a story, chapter 1, verse 41. Now, I'm not saying First Maccabees is part of the canon of Scripture, but it's a historical book. It tells some good history. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. After all, they were just Gentiles. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And not only that, he sent his soldiers all throughout the different villages of Judah, where they would set up an idol and an altar and sacrifice to Zeus. And they came to this little village of Modin, where there lived an old priest named Mattathias, who had 5 sons. And they set up the altar and they began the pagan sacrifices. And he rushed forward. He says, that will not be it. And the Jewish man who was getting ready to offer the sacrifice, Matthias snatched the sword from his hand and killed him. None of my people will worship these pagan gods. And when the Seleucid soldiers went to arrest him, his sons jumped into the fray. And before you know it, a rebellion had broke out, starting in this little village, but the rebellion grew and developed. Verse 33 says, those who have insight among the people will give understanding to many. Yet they will fall by the sword and flame and by captivity and by plunder for many days. Matthias, and of course he's old, so he doesn't live very long. And the Seleucids who counterattack, they say, wait a minute, these Jews all rest on the Sabbath, so all we have to do is wait on the Sabbath. We'll attack on the Sabbath. They won't work, they won't fight, they won't do it. We'll just attack them on the Sabbath and we'll be able to kill them. And that's exactly what takes place. And many of the Jews are slaughtered on the Sabbath day until Matthias says, it's okay to defend ourselves on the Sabbath. Yes, I know that was not specifically written in law, but it's okay to save a life on the Sabbath. After all, David went and even was allowed to eat that food that was only for the priests because he was going to starve to death, and need outranks those commands. As long as we're faithful to the Lord, well, we won't attack, but we can defend. And so notice they're given understanding, and yet many fall by the sword and by captivity and by plunder for many days. And so this issue of fighting on the Sabbath is secure. Verse 34, now when they fall, they will be granted a little help. They're actually joined by a company that are called you've heard of the Hasidim, the Hasidians. This is mentioned in 1 Maccabees chapter 2. And then others who had initially gone along with that Hellenization process, who had initially said, yeah, we'll just, whichever way the wind is blowing. Now other Jewish people begin to join the revolt. No, we're going to commit ourselves to this group. The rebellious group, become known as the Maccabees. The word Maccabee means to hammer, and the middle son of Matthias, Judas the Maccabee, Judas the Hammer, his name actually gives name to the entire rebellion. So we refer to it as the Maccabean Rebellion. Verse 35, some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Notice this, what they learn here. And what they begin here is going to have ramifications that will continue. And so Mattathias dies, but the temple is restored. It takes about 3.5 years from the time it was desecrated to the time when the restoration takes place. Those numbers are seen elsewhere in the book of Daniel. We saw them in chapter 8. The temple is restored, and that restoration is still celebrated to this day in what our Jewish friends refer to. It's called the Feast of Dedication, but the way you say that in Hebrew is Hanukkah. It just means dedication. And to this day, they celebrate the time when the temple was cleansed and those foreign objects were removed. And they said, never again will we worship pagan gods and allow our temple to be desecrated. Verse 36, then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god. This is going back to sort of rehashing what Antiochus had done. Antiochus, notice I've got a second word after his name. It's the nickname that he gives himself, Antiochus Epiphanes. We'll explain the meaning of that in just a minute. He will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. He will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. What you're looking at here is a coin of Antiochus Epiphanes. You say, well, I can't really see any writing. I just see his face here. But if we flip it over to the other side, we see, and you have to turn your to the side, but we see that he's the king Antiochus, and then beyond that you have Theo Epiphanes. Theo is short for theos. That's the Greek word for God. God manifested. God, can I say it this way? God incarnate. And that's the title that Antiochus gives to himself. Now, the Jewish people didn't like that title. They nicknamed him Antiochus Epiphanes. Sort of sounds like Epiphanes. Epiphanes means Antiochus is a madman. But he called himself in Greek Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the Magnificent, Antiochus the one, the Epiphany, we would say, the one who is, and what the coin here says, Antiochus, God manifested. And that stands in contrast to what we see when the Christ comes, the true Christ, of which Antiochus, I think, is an antichrist. When the true Christ comes, we see written about him in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5, have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. You see, he actually was God incarnate. But instead of presenting himself that way, notice, he emptied himself. Doesn't mean he ceased to become what he was, but it means instead of saying, here I am, God appearing, he took instead the form of a bondservant. And being made in the likeness of men, he took a very different approach. Instead of saying, I am wonderful, look at me, he said, no, I am a servant. Look at God. He becomes a mediator, the one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. The Antichrist exalted himself and ultimately fell to his death. But the true Christ was lifted up, yes, that was his exaltation, was lifted up for us to die in our place and gave his life as a servant for our salvation, that as we trust in him, we can have eternal life.